Chief Executive Grunt is his official title, in case anybody doubted. Unlike Royce. That's not Royce's official title. Although I think
that is my official title.
Chief Executive Grunt? No, that is.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Grunt Jr. That's more the affectionate alias. There was a couple people who said, they're aspiring developers. I do have a blog post I wrote. Let's get that back. There's a lot of stuff in here. It's about a year old, but I, in particular, have things at the bottom that talk about some of the training material I used with my son. He's 15 now. He's just finished his first year at level 12. I think I started him in software development stuff very minimally, probably around age 10 or 11. And I think the tools that I've got listed down there are probably pretty helpful. Even if you're trying to get into it, like if you've never programmed before, there's a really cool thing called RoboMind, which I think can be really helpful in learning how to do text-based programming and actually having like things to do with it. Because I think that's the hardest part about learning programming sometimes is you get the syntax, but then you're like, okay, what do I do with this now? And so they have a whole series of lessons where you run this little robot around and pick up mines or pick up orbs or whatever it is, and various little algorithms you have to run, and you get familiar with procedural programming and loops and if statements. And if you've never programmed before, even though it's kind of geared towards kids, it's really going to be helpful. And there's a lot of other resources in there as well. Okay, so I'm going to transition. You ready? Yep. Okay, I'm going to transition to talking about logging and a CLI context. And so what I'm going to try to do here is present, I've created a really small demo application that has combined a few things that for most CLI applications you don't do because it's not all put together for you, and so you usually kind of skip it. Maybe you just run a script instead of having multiple commands in there and separate options for the commands, kind of like Git. If you've used Git at the command line, you can throw some options in there and it does different things, or it's got different subcommands and subcommands of subcommands, and that stuff seems like it's all really complicated, but it doesn't have to be. We're also going to look at config files. How do we wire a config file in there in such a way that it picks up? It can be set. Configuration options can be set through environment variables, as well as CLI options, as well as the file. And so that's ideally, if you have an application you can install on the system, you can set up your defaults in your file. If you don't have control of that, you can override them with environment variables. And if you're launching the command yourself, then you can tweak the options. And so it's just a nice way to kind of have fallback different ways of configuring the program and how it's going to behave when it gets run. Command line interface. Good job. By the way, I like interaction. So if you have any questions, if I'm saying things that doesn't make sense, please raise your hand and ask the question. And what I mean by that is really this. So if this scares you, I'm sorry. That's what the talk's about. You'll hopefully learn a little bit. As opposed to GitHub, which is a web application. It's running in a web context. I access it through my browser, through the network. A CLI application is almost always going to run on the machine you're interacting with, and you're going to interact with it through the command line interface. Any questions about any of that? Let's see. Config. Oh, logging. And so really the other big part of this application that we're going to look at is how do you tie logging into this application in such a way that it's relatively easily configured, and you have some flexibility on the command line about what level you want to log at. So that's another thing that we're going to take a look at. Any questions, initial questions? What? Oh, text size, okay. Good? Okay, so this is the advanced talk. We're doing it a little bit differently because I need to leave after this talk and I can't stay for the whole time. So this is the advanced talk. Colin is going to give the beginner's talk after this. So I'm going to jump in. I'm going to skip some things like how I activated the virtual environment. What is a virtual environment? Those are things that you can look up or stay after and ask some questions for. So I have a running virtual environment. And I have my editor opened in the context of that virtual environment. And That's going to give me things like linting in my editor. So if you didn't understand any of that stuff, write it down. Be happy to explain it to you here in a little bit or after the meeting. So the first thing I want to do is show you that I have a requirements file in here. The requirements file is how I specify. Oh, okay. Man, you're picky. One more, maybe. Good. Okay. This file, I can show it in here as well. It's in the directory. So if you want to clone this, it's on GitHub. It's not under DerbyPy. I'll put it under there later. Right now it's just under our Syring, but you can go grab this. It's open source. Do whatever you want with it. Use it as a starter template if you want to do a CLI app. We require a few different dependencies, so we require some libraries that don't come in the standard library, and the requirements file is a pretty idiomatic way of specifying dependencies in Python. You're going to use the pip tool to install those typically. There are other methods of getting dependencies installed, but again, I'm just going to kind of skip over that for now. The big thing to know is that click is the application. It's the library that's giving me a really easy way to create CLI applications. So it's done a lot of the hard work of defining how I'm going to build a CLI app. It's got great documentation. You can go out there and just Google Python click and look at the docs, and it's very simple. They got a lot of great introductory quick start stuff, and then you can go deeper as you want to. Aptors is a library that gives me system-specific locations. So, for example, where is the user-based configuration location on this machine? Well, that's a different file path on Linux than it is on Windows, than it is on Mac. And so this aptors kind of glosses over those differences, and as an application developer, I can kind of forget that those are different and just pick the one that I want by kind of concept. Python.env is a way for me to read a .environment file, which is a way to get basically set environment variables from a file. And so this is the way that we use. This is the way that this application gets configuration. Is it's going to create an environment file and load that as part of its startup. And then Python JSON logger is for logging. It allows us to log a JSON, what would you call it, record, I guess. It allows you to log a JSON record instead of just like the message. And so what that allows you to do is push your logs up to something like Logzio, or you could parse them yourself, I guess. But it allows you to add more context. Like a lot of times, maybe you've got the date and you've got the application and then you've got the message. Well, I want line number. I want exception. Traceback. Like there's all kinds of things that the Python logger can give me. But if I put all that stuff in there, how do I parse it? Well, JSON's already there. Let's use it. And so this is a library that does some of the heavy lifting there and makes it a little bit easier for me as a developer to not have to worry about all that kind of esoteric stuff. So those are the libraries. That's what we're using them for. Other than these 4 libraries, everything else is standard library.
So just out of curiosity, what is the -e dot?
Oh, that's a good question. So -e dot essentially does pip install -e dot in the current directory, which for my application, because of this line right here, the entry point, it's basically a way of telling pip, which is going to do the kind of the site packages, path directory setup. It tells it, I want this application to be in my path, and I want it to be in editable mode, which means don't take all the files and copy them in, just create a link. Because otherwise, if you do copy them all over, you'll be editing stuff, but the application as you're running it won't be the files you're editing. It'll be the ones that got copied over, which are old once you start editing them. So -e dot says install this application in the Python path and make it editable. Any other questions? Okay, so the first thing that we're going to look at is I could run this application. I could change directory and do Python CLI.py. No, I can't. Okay. Guess you are going to get to see me install some stuff. Okay, so I could run my program by typing python CLI.py. Perfectly legitimate. The way that I set up CLI.py, oops. This option here at the bottom is the way to tell Python if this is the main module that's being ran. So python CLI.py, if CLI.py is that file, go ahead and run the CLI function, and we'll talk about what the CLI function is in here just a second. So this is a perfectly legitimate way to run the file, but it's not very user-friendly. It's kind of weird, and I'd rather have my own name, just like I don't run Python get.py, get's not Python, but I have a get command. So for the CLI applications that I have, I usually want an application binary in my path to run my program, just because I think that's better UX, and because I don't have to know the exact path to the file. Then it's just a command that I can run on my path. So in order to get that in Python, the setup tools package has some nice functionality built in called entry points, and I can use a specific type of entry point to declare console scripts. And that will cause, pip will use that information, and or setup tools, I'm not sure which one actually does it, will use that information to actually create a binary for me that will launch this program, and it will load this module. So this is logging CLI is the module that I've created. It's the top level package actually. .cli is the file, it's the module, and then this CLI is the function inside the module. So this is telling, if you look at my paths, I'm just going to show you that it's there. This is saying logging CLI is the top level package. In Python, when we look for files, we use dots, not slashes. So it's going to be .cli. The .py is going to go away when we're importing modules. We don't worry about the file extension. And then inside that module, once Python can locate the file, then inside that file, it needs to know what to run. And so this last CLI says, look for a callable CLI and call it, which is exactly what I've set up here to set up that CLI function, which is the entry point into the program. So whether I run python CLI.py and it gets called here, or whether I use the setup tools mechanism to create the binary and give it that identifier here, either way, that CLI function is getting called in the context of the virtual environment that got set up. Any questions about that? I know I'm running through it kind of quick. The code's up there, so you can feel free to dig through it and ask questions in the comments, or leave an issue, open an issue on the repo if you want to, and I can explain some things. So that's the entry point. We want that CLI function to get called, and that CLI function has a lot of special functionality because of all these decorators. So the first one is group. And so the way that this, I guess, let me show you that the binary version works too. So I can just run logging CLI. If I do which, it tells me that this is the location of the binary. Because I activated the virtual environment, that's on my path. That path is right here. So when I run logging CLI, because that path is in my path environment variable, Bash is going to look in those paths. It's going to find logging CLI. It's going to run it. This script is actually nothing more than a Python script, I'm pretty sure, with a, what do you call it, a whiz bang? That's not it. Shebang at the top. So that's all it is. It's just a little bit of Python that's going to set up the environment for me in the correct virtual environment.
I got created because you had that -e dot in your requirements.
Nope, that actually got created because, so the -e dot has to be ran, but it got created entry points because of the console script entry point setup in setup.py. Any other questions? Okay, so first things first, let's actually talk about how the CLI program works. As I said, Click has a lot of good documentation. I'm not going to make this an overview of Click because I really want to get into other things, or I'm not going to make this a deep dive. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction here to Click and kind of how it works in its typical configuration. So I ran my logging CLI command earlier, and you'll see that I have a nice usage message. It shows me the binary command that I ran. It shows me the options that I have, or it shows me where my options would go if I wanted to use them. It shows me the command that I'm going to run and the args. It shows me the options that are available to me, which I've all configured. Those are custom. So the creation of this usage message is something that Click does based on all the meta information. But the actual creation of options, except for help, and the commands are things that have come through the code that I'll show you next. So usage message is, you can customize all of this stuff if you want to, but typically you don't need to, which is why you're using Click in the first place, to just get some, some speed in your time to market, if you will. Okay, so the very top of the program then in Click becomes a group. And the group is all of your initial commands fall up under that group. And I execute that group, I get it to run by calling it. So if you remember, there was that CLI function that got called down here. There was the CLI function that got called through, the setup work that's done here. And either way, this function is getting called as the entry point to the program. And it knows it's a group, and behind the scenes, Click is kind of building up these objects that it ultimately calls as you go through and define them. Decorators in Python, if you're not familiar with them, they decorate the function below it. And so this decorator is actually decorating this decorator, which is decorating this decorator, and so on, all the way down to the last decorator, which is decorating the function. Did I do that right, or I did it in reverse? I actually did it in reverse, didn't I? So technically, no, I guess it works either way. It works either way. So decorators, Click uses decorators to let you configure how the CLI is going to be represented, what the structures are of the commands, what options are available to the commands. And it seems pretty self-explanatory. I mean, when you look at this, you see that I've got a group, and then I've got some options. These things look like the type of POSIX options you would see in your, as you use command line applications. And at least to me, but maybe it doesn't. Does this look confusing to anybody? Raise your hand. Yeah.
I just want to clarify.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just want to clarify the order
of
decoration. Does it? So the first decorator at the bottom.
Yep.
Decorates the CLI function.
Yes, that actually happens.
The one above.
Yep.
22 decorates 23, etc.
Yeah. The order of operations is from the function up.
Okay.
Any questions about this? Okay. So you'll see that I have this main group. We'll talk about some of the functionality in this function later. What I really want to show you is I have a command. So up above, I did not use command. I used group. And I decorated the CLI function. So here's the interesting part. To now get a command associated with that group, which I need to do for all of my initial top-level commands, I don't actually use click.command, I use CLI.command. So I use the function that was decorated to then decorate the commands that I want to belong to that function. So this CLI object is this function. It would normally, if you didn't have any of those decorators on it and you tried to do .command here, it would give you an attribute error. Function CLI has no attribute command. but it's the click machinery that's adding stuff to that function to give you a nice developer user experience for creating CLI applications. So this is my log stuff command. All it's going to do is log information messages at different severity levels. I have a version command, which is actually going to pull, I'm not going to get into this, but the way we set up the version of this application, you only define it in one place, which is really nice if you're actually producing software and trying to do semantic versioning. I only have to update in that one place, and then it's updated in the package, and it's updated in the documentation, and then it's updated on the CLI command as well, and you can inspect that even if you want to, if you're also importing your application from a library perspective. I also have a config command. You'll see that I'm using underscores here. The main reason I'm using underscores is because I have some other I have some other variables in this module that would conflict otherwise, and that can actually be pretty confusing because you get really weird error messages, and it's because you're overwriting the name variable. So you'll see I have version and I have config. So when I get down to here, I'm using the underscore version to differentiate, but then I'm naming the command in order to get the command I want without the underscore. And honestly, now that I'm thinking about it, I bet you click just does that automatically. I bet you it removes the. Anyway, let's see. I'm curious now. Nope, it doesn't. That's interesting. Okay. Yeah, in case anybody didn't see that, I was looking and it did put a dash in there. It changed that underscore to a dash. Okay, so I have 3 commands. I have a single group. If I wanted to, I could create a config group. I could make that a group instead of a command, and then I could hang more commands off of that. It could have its own subgroup. We've got production applications that have all kinds of subgroups underneath other ones. Okay, so any questions about just hierarchy of commands or how they get defined? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about logging, because logging is really the main reason why this application was created. I wanted to show how logging and CLI options work together pretty nicely. So one of the main things that you have to understand about Python logging, let's go here. So one of the main things you have to understand with Python logging is that as a developer, when you want to create a log, there's really only 2 things you need to think about. One is, what do I want the message to be? And 2 is, what severity is it? So when you're programming, that's the only thing that you care about. The only thing. A lot of times, because we're also kind of running our code as an application, we're also thinking about things in terms of like, well, where do I want this to go? And what format do I want it to be in? And you can have all these questions because logging can be very complicated. I could have certain logs go one place. I could have other types of logs go to another place. I could want some logs to come to standard out when I run. I could want some logs to only go to syslogs. I could want some logs that go to syslog to be JSON. I could want the ones that come to the CLI output to just be plain text. And so there's all these considerations, but those considerations in terms of where do the logs go and what do they look like, all of those things happen like at application deployment time. As a developer, all I should worry about is message and severity. That will help you tremendously. Now, technically, you could do some fancy stuff, and you may want to add additional context to your log messages, and you can go beyond that. But, I've been doing production Python development for about 12 years now, and for the most part, all I ever think about is what's the message and what's the severity level. So any questions about those 2 principles? Say it.
You can get pretty fancy with that message.
Oh, sure. Yep.
Embellish it any way you want.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can get, again, you could get fancy. Is it struct log that Nick was talking about? Wasn't that what it was called? Oh, you don't know. One of our developers, there's a library that you can use that supplements, and you can add like keyword arts to the log. And so you can get that context without having to always like format it into the string message, which can be really helpful depending upon what you're doing with the logs. But again, if you're going to get to that level, you really need to put some thought into your logging infrastructure. It's probably not something you're going to start off with. And at least in my context, I'd say 99 times out of 100, a simple log message with the variables that I'm concerned about is usually sufficient. So that's message. So let's talk about severity. These are the 4 severity levels that I think Python defines by default. I'm not missing one, am I? I think it's just these 4. You can define other ones if you had a reason to, but these usually work. In my mind, what these map to is error and warning are always shown. I almost never hide them unless I've got something really annoying where there's a warning that for whatever reason is like repeating like 10,000 times every time the application is run, in which case you might want to turn that one off. Error messages, I always want those to come through. I always want to see those. You can also use log.exception, which will give you a error severity message, but it'll include the stack trace, which is really helpful. I do that a lot. If you catch an exception and you're going to ignore it, a lot of times it's helpful to log that exception. You just do log.exception, add a message, and then at least it's in your logs and you can get a sense of how many times it's happening, and make sure that you're not hiding something that you thought was only going to happen once, but lo and behold, 80% of your users are actually running into that problem. So log.exception is also helpful. So error warning usually are shown. For me, info means I want somebody to see it. And usually what that means is in a CLI context, I want it to actually show up in the output. And the other thing that it means is in a server context, so like if I have an app running as a web app, it means I want those logs in my syslog, which hopefully I'm shipping off the machine to a log aggregator like Logzio so that it's really easy to review my logs and synchronize them between servers if I need to. And preferably for the syslog in a JSON format that's adding a lot of additional context. So this would be one of those type of messages where when I show info on the command line, when I show info messages in standard error, I think probably, I'm not going to want to see JSON output with like 15 fields. I just want the message. But that same message I want to go to syslog at the same time as JSON, and we'll talk about how that happens here in just a second. So any questions about logging? And then debug. So debug is for, as a developer, if I know I've got a problem and I need really detailed information, I can turn debug logging on, usually in a very specific context, in a very specific module, to get that really detailed output to help me troubleshoot something, because sometimes I can't reproduce bugs locally that I'm seeing in production, and in those cases, logging at the debug level and turning that on in production will give me really detailed logs, but only in one area, as opposed to like turning on debug logging for the entire application, which I'm sure plenty of production apps have actually crashed after you accidentally do that. So, the amount of logging you can do at the debug level can be extremely verbose, and you can kind of bring your application to its knees if you're not careful about what you're doing with that in a production context.
So how do you handle the amount of logs that you're creating and retention and deletion so that you're not chewing up space?
Disk space. So all of that is the sysadmin's job. He needs to handle log rotation, or they need to handle log shipping. From my perspective, what we do, we run standard Ubuntu. Log rotate handles most of it for us. We use Ansible to do deployment. When we deploy a Python web app, we drop a log rotate file for that app to make sure we're rotating its logs, to actually siphon those logs off, put them in their own file, and then rotate them. And we also drop our syslog configuration file for that app, which takes those logs, siphons them off, and puts them into LogZio. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I think actually LogZio happens at the server level. I think we just ship everything in LogZio to the server, so it kind of happens by default. Yeah, so log rotate. I guess, okay, so the rsyslog configuration file siphons the logs off and puts them in a certain location. The log rotate configuration file is what handles trimming them and making sure they don't take up all disk space. Any other questions about that? Okay, so we're going to show, okay, so you've got these different logging levels. And so I'm going to show what this looks like. Okay, so from my perspective as a developer, I want the default way that my logging works in a CLI application to show me warnings, errors, and info messages. Now, hopefully, most of the time, I don't have a lot of errors and I don't have a lot of warning messages. And so you'll notice that this looks a little bit different. And this is actually deliberate for me. If I have errors or warnings, I really want those to stand out in the interface. I want to see that it's an error or a warning. Most of the time you can tell by the message itself, but I don't want to guess. I want it to be very explicit because explicit is better than implicit. But for my normal messages, I personally don't want it to say, what's going to say notice here? Info. I don't want it to say info and I don't need to know where it's coming from. At least that's my preference. You could clearly create your own default. But again, for me, that's because that preface for me says, hey, you need to pay more attention to this, whereas the lack of that preface tells me it's just a normal message, and I'm just kind of satisfied with that. So again, logging and warning, you can't turn those off. I mean, you could, but not easily in this application. You'd have to set up some custom logging to make that happen. And so typically this is how I run stuff. If I'm going to run a command, I'm going to import some files. I've usually got messages in there that say something like, especially if it's going to be a big file, I'll say importing and I'll give the full file path to make sure it's doing the one I think. I'll give another message that says starting the import. I might do something that outputs a dot every time I loop through 1,000 records so I just know, hey, this is actually working. And I'll probably do something at the end like imported, and then I'll give the total number of records, and then the CLI will return to the prompt, and then I'll know that it's finished. So that's what I would typically see. But we also have times, a lot of times these CLI commands get used in cron jobs or Windows. It would be task scheduler. These days, if you're on Linux, you can even use systemd timers to schedule these things. The point is, you're scheduling the CLI command to be ran. One really benefit or annoyance, depending upon your perspective, is a cron job. If you run a cron job in Linux and that cron job outputs any output, it'll try to email the user. So this is actually a really good way to fill up your disk in a way that's not usually easy to see, because you can fill up that mailbox, and a lot of times the application users that you're running this stuff under, it's not a real person, it's not mapped to an email, and so if you're creating a lot of output for one of your commands and it's running every 5 minutes, the next thing you know, you're missing like 30 gigs of disk space, and you got this one huge mailbox file sitting in the user directory, and so. A lot of people end up piping that output where? Dev null. You know what the great thing about dev null is? It doesn't fill up. You know what the awful thing about dev null is? You have no idea you've got a problem when you have one. And so one of the methods that I picked up a number of years ago was I said, by default, I'd like a way to silence info level output for cron jobs. That was my thought at the time. I'm going to assume it's running well. If it's on a scheduled task, I'm going to assume it's running well. But if there's errors or warnings, that stuff will still show up in the output. That will show up to the cron job, and it will end up emailing me, and I'll see that there's problems. This is especially useful before we had tools like Sentry to know if there was an exception, like the script actually bombed. So that was really helpful in those days. We've got Sentry now, which helps with that. And actually, while I'm thinking about it, let me show a couple of tools here. So if you don't know about this, Sentry is a great tool for capturing stack traces. and notifying you when your processes have had errors. If you want, you can self-host the server, and I think it's all open source. It doesn't cost you anything if you want to go through the DevOps work of setting up the server. So really helpful tool. Another tool that we use to help with cron jobs. One of the things that's awful about cron jobs is it's great if they email you when they error out. It's terrible if they stop running and you don't know it. And so this is one of the tools that we use, Chronitor. There's a number of them like it. Basically, you set up heartbeat monitors that will alert you if they don't get a ping, which is really like an HTTP GET request. They'll alert you if that doesn't come in on time. So if I've got a cron job that needs to run every 5 minutes, I know the cron job should never take more than 5 seconds. I can set something up to notify me if it doesn't get an HTTP ping every 6 minutes. And that tells me, hey, I just accidentally configured something wrong. I removed the cron job by accident, or for some other reason it's not running. And that gives me a warm fuzzy that I know that command is running on schedule. And if not, somebody will let me know. The last thing I'm going to show here is I've actually moved away from the whole info warning to cron, kind of create a cron notice to me. Instead, what we've moved to now is cron sentry, which is a prefix command. It's a command that you can feed other commands to. And what it will do is spawn itself, and then it will spawn a fork of the command that you want to run. And if that forked process errors out, if it returns an error code other than 0, it'll take all the output and it will send something to Sentry. And normally you're setting your Sentry up to then notify you if that type of stuff happens. So we use Sentry as a kind of a centralized alert system. Chronitor notifies us directly in Slack, but we try to run everything else through Sentry. And so it's a really nice way to no longer have to worry about if I've got input or output, because cron sentry will take all of that output, and if it doesn't error out, then it just kind of ignores all of that output, and it doesn't send you an email like cron used to. Okay, so back to the code. I've got different error messages. So here's ultimately what I want to do. I want to be able to silence the info error messages. And so I've set this up to be an option. I guess I can go back and just show you the help message. You'll notice that I've got a couple options here. I've got quiet, info, and debug. So the first thing I want to show you is I can run that same command I ran earlier, and you'll notice there was no debug output. I actually ran four commands, 4 logging commands, but the debug output didn't come out. I'm going to add the debug flag now to the CLI app, and now I'm going to see, that's interesting. Okay, I'm going to see the one that I did below. I'm also going to see in my library code that sets up the logger, I've added a debug output to tell me where am I trying to send syslogs to, which was part of an error solution when I actually built this. I wanted to see where that was going. So we'll actually talk about how this works here in just a second. I just want to show you what it does. So when I remove that, we're back to no info. We're back to no debug messages. And then if I want to silence those info level messages, I can use the quiet flag. And now I'm only going to get errors and warnings. We'll go into how we do that. Any questions, though, about how the flags work or what I'm doing, how they're corresponding to the different levels of logging, the different severity levels of the logs? Okay, so let's talk about how we do this. The first thing that we want to do is we want to know how to actually get those, how do we get a hold of those options? And you'll notice that those options come before the command. So I have the program name, logging CLI. My logging related flags come next. My logging related options come next because they're global options. They don't depend on which command I select. They're global to the application. And then you have the actual command that you want to run. And I could run a different command like version, and that's still going to show up because I used a print statement instead of a log statement to make that happen. Any questions on that?
happens if you put in an invalid command?
So click takes care of all that for you. Tells you to use help, and it tells you no such command. Yep. Okay, so let's talk about how we do that. The first thing you'll notice is that I'm using different flags, and there's different ways you could do this. You could have each one of these, I guess, options. You could have each one of these options be like a separate click option, but they also have kind of a cool way to make multiple options end up in the same. So there's different ways to set multiple options to affect the same variable as it's passed in. So what I could do here, if I didn't have all of these log level statements and these options, click would actually complain. Here, let me show you actually. Let's do. Oh, it's probably going to bark at me because I don't have. Oh, it didn't. There. Okay. So each one of those options by default is going to try to give you a variable passed to the function that matches the name of the option. So right now what click is trying to do is it's trying to give me a quiet, info, and debug variable passed as an option to the function, but I'm not accepting that parameter down here. So that's what it's complaining about. It's saying, hey, CLI, the function, got a keyword argument quiet, but you're not actually trying to get it. You're not accepting that argument. So I could create 3 different variables here. I could create quiet, info, and debug. And then I would have to delete log level because it wouldn't be giving me that option. It wouldn't be giving me that argument. And so I think that might work. Oop. Oh, of course. Okay, I'm not going to go into that. But I'm just showing that normally an option would stand on its own and it would result in a parameter of the same name passed into the function. Instead, by using this second argument here to the option call, I'm telling it, hey, I want you to put the info into a variable called log level, which is here. And then I'm saying, when you use this option, change the value of log level to be this string. So I want either quiet, info, or debug. And then I'm also saying use the info level as my default. So if I've not passed any options, treat it as if I passed -- info. And ultimately what I get here is log level, and log level is going to be a string of either quiet, info, or debug. It has to be one of those 3 values. So I take that value and I pass it into logs init logging, and this is really where we do the bulk of the setup here. I guess I created I forgot I did that. We also have a separate flag for whether or not we want to log to syslog, if we want that log to actually go to the syslog server. So init logging, what does it do for us? It checks the level, and it checks it in kind of priority order. So the way Python works is if I want to log at the debug level, it means I get debug and everything with a higher priority. So I get debug, info, warning, and error. If I log at info, I get info, warning, error. If I log at warning, I get warning and error, right? So it takes it and everything above it. So I don't need to when I start to set the logging level, when I tell the application this is what I actually want you to output, I don't need to set like all of them. I just need to set the one that's the most granular. And so I'm doing that here. I'm basically just saying if I've got a debug level, then I set my minimum level to debug. Hang on just a second. Sorry. I'm trying to figure out what that is. Logging.getLogger. BSSH host logger. I don't think we actually... Yeah. this isn't actually needed in this app. This was from the app that I built earlier. So, good. Okay. So all I'm trying to do is set minimum level here. And remember that this level is going to be debug. It's going to be the string debug info or quiet. And so from my perspective, if it's debug, I'm setting debug. If it's info, now this is interesting, and there's a reason why I'm doing this. So even if it's quiet, I'm still setting the minimum level to info. Anybody want to guess why? I want it in my syslog, that's right. So I always want the ability to go figure out what my application did if I want to. I just don't want all of the noise in front of me immediately. So even though I'm telling it to be quiet, I still want all of that information to be somewhere I can go look for it. And so for this application, what quiet really means is still log at the info level, but don't set up the handler, which takes all those messages and puts them on standard out. So there's kind of two things going on. What level am I logging at? And then the handler is what knows how to take that message and send it somewhere. So the very first thing I do is set the minimum level. Root logger is like the root logger, and this is going to affect the root and it's going to affect everything else. And so in Python, if I wanted to set something specific, I would kind of go down the chain, I would find that logger, and I would set a different level on it. By setting it at the root level, by default, it's going to affect everything, which is what I want to do for this app. If I wanted like a very specific option to debug SQLchemy, let's say, which is an ORM, I want to see what my database stuff is doing, then I would have to set that up kind of custom in the app. I'd have to go find their logger, and I'd have to go turn on info logging, and then I have to give it a handler to output to standard out or something like that. init standard out logging, we'll go to that next. And this is an exception because the way that the CI servers that we have don't actually have syslog on them, and so I don't want to set up syslog logging if I'm in running my tests in continuous integration environment. So let's look at standard out logging. This is where we create our handler. So this is the stream handler. This is the formatter. So the handler is what knows how to take the message and put it somewhere. So the stream handler knows how to put it on standard air. The formatter is how do you want it to look? What fields are you going to use and what order? This is really important in Python. You have to synchronize the handler's logging level, and you have to synchronize the logger's level. And if you get either one of those wrong, you'll bang your head for hours trying to figure out why the messages aren't showing up where you want them to be. Yes, sir.
You know that from experience?
Oh, I do. You bet I do. And in some ways, I'm even wondering as I look at this, I'm like, why am I even doing it like this? If level is quiet, I probably should have done that above. I don't even know. There's no reason to initialize the handler. So I probably should have moved that up here to init. I shouldn't even call init standard out logging if level is quiet. But this is where we're bolting. If it's quiet, we're setting up the handler, but we're not adding it to the logger. And so the handler kind of exists as a class. It's a thing, but it's not been connected to the logger, so it doesn't do anything. And if it's quiet, or if it's info level or debug, then it's going to go ahead and set that handler up. I'm not going to get into the warnings. You can read into those, and I've got some comments there. We've also got the syslog logging. This is a little bit different. The create syslog handler is doing some things to figure out how do I log to syslog? Where is syslog? That's involved here. And then it's also setting up a JSON, where is it? Add handler, create syslog handler, set level, add handler. I guess I set it up down here. Yeah, I think this is coming from, nope. Where's JSON logger? Okay. JSON formatter. Sorry, give me just a second. Create JSON formatter. Maybe use a few two levels of redirection. There we go. That's what I was looking at. So this ties into that JSON library I discussed earlier, which is configured to help you. And so again, you can look at that. You can read the documentation. It's all right there in front of you. The net result of this is that for me, syslog logging is JSON. I'm not looking for my syslogs to be easily readable. If I want them to be, there's a tool called JQ, which is a CLI tool that allows me to parse JSON from a log message like that. And so if I really need to, I could clean up the JSON to look at it. But again, most of my logs are going to Logzio, and it's parsing that JSON for me and putting it into a nice tabular format. So syslog logs are always turned on unless they're in CI, and standard out is on unless it's quiet level, and all that stuff is happening here in the logs. Any questions? And I thought I wasn't going to have enough to talk about, right? Okay, so I'm going to stop there. There's actually more in this application. Just to show you the files really briefly, which I'm going to have to open this to do because I don't know the names. You've got the config. The config file is where we're setting up some values. Again, they're pulling from the environment. FS paths is going to create some paths for us, but then it's also going to, I thought it did, or is it in CLI? Yeah, load.env. Here we go. So this is how the application loads a configuration file if it's in the correct place in the application. So I'm sorry this went a little bit longer than I thought it would. But there's some good other stuff in there in terms of configuration and pulling values from the environment if you want to take a look. And I'll push the couple changes I made up here later tonight or tomorrow and get it on the DerbyPy GitHub if you want to take a look at it. Any questions?
On the option with Sentry, you have is flag equals true. You were talking about the other ones when you move the log level. Is that the default and you're just being explicit to put that there? Or?
Yeah, so the key here is because I've used flag value, it automatically knows it's a flag. So I don't have to use isFlag. But because of this one, normally you would define an option with something like with Sentry and then -- no Sentry. But I just find that extra option when it's the default to be noisy. And so from a better UX perspective, I take that away. But because I don't have that slash in there and I'm not giving it two options, Click doesn't realize that option is a flag option, and so I have to set the isFlag true to tell it that it needs to consider it as a flag. And flag being essentially on/off, it's true or false. Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Take a little break to get Colin ready.